All right. We have a backlog of many things in our platform, right? And one of them is this manager. And what I'm going to talk about is NX Workspace. So typically, when you build an app, you have a package JSON, and then you have a folder, and you are really good developer. So you just manage folder structure and make sure that, oh, I have a lazy loaded part in this folder, and it's not touching anything else. And I don't know how you can guarantee that, but I can guarantee you you've been wrong, because that's what we thought we had. And that was not a monorepo, it was just one big pile of code, right? When I started, we switched over to NX Workspace, and we've been hammering on that ever since, shrinking our manager from 60,000 lines of code. And now it's been growing. So it's 162,000 lines of code, but it's now shared into 270 different libraries. And that means every library has a set of rules, which is really nice when you're a developer, because it's actually up to us to define those rules. That's also one of the nice things about NX. So it doesn't dictate that, oh, you have to do it this way. I was actually a little bit surprised when I read the documentation the first time. It didn't say how to use tagging. And but I want to know how, but there's no magic there. It is just tags that depend on each other. I'll show you that in a minute. So this is our code base. We have 162,000 lines of code. We have 60,000 lines of code that Sonar Cloud wants us to test. And of that, 37,000 is already tested. So we're in okay shape, not in any way perfect shape, but we're not aiming for 100, no means. But it's going the right direction. So what we're looking at is really the trend. Are we going up in coverage? And I can guarantee you we've also been going up in lines of code over time. So how do we manage this? NX is the best in class for supporting monorepos. It has a complete understanding of the project graph. So it knows exactly from these 270 projects how they are connected to each other. I'm not going to show that because it's just going to be a lot of lines, but I can guarantee you it's doing an awesome job at it. And that means if you're only changing something in the top, then it only needs to build that affected stuff on your pull request. If you're changing stuff at the bottom, it's really nice to know that, hey, I'm actually testing that everything else works together with my change down in the bottom, right? It's not nice if you always change the bottom because it takes a long time to test everything, but that's where the computation cache and stuff like that comes in, and it's really smart. Some of the things they promise is up to 14 times bigger or faster loads for large setups, and I believe we have a large setup, otherwise we're in for a treat. But we do see quite insane improvements. We also see when it goes wrong. We saw that last week when some of our TypeScript validate ended up taking 2 hours to run. And that was just because of some tailwind, the types that were wrong. So when we fixed that, it was down to now 10 minutes. 10 minutes is still a long time, but it's also when you're running on 200 projects, it's a decent size, right? So NX, like I said, it understands the project graph from your applications up top and how it's connected to all the libraries down below. So if I change this one, everything above it will be tested on my pull request. If I change this one, I don't have to run the test for everything down here because it's not affecting that. And that understanding you can't really get unless you have a monorepo tool like this, or Yarn Workspaces, or Learner, or some of the other tools out there. If we look at it, try to make a dumbed down version of our manager here. The manager is what we call the host. That is the frame out here, right? And then this is going to be an Iris app. That's why you can install a Fleet extension. Inside this Fleet extension, we're using some components. It's React components that has this tab kind of layout. And it's also dependent on our CSS components, which we have, because CSS component is just controlling the styling of this. We're using Tailwind. So we have a library purely for CSS. And that means we can build Svelte components or Angular components and just have it use this one, and it will look the same. Might behave differently depending on what you put up here, right? But it's really nice to know that we didn't log us in on being only React. Right? So what I wanted to show you here is not really just that we have some pretty things here, but NX has this concept of enforced project boundaries. It's basically just an ESLint rule that says, all right, you cannot talk to this one. And you can talk to this one, but not this one. And that's the tagging that I talked about. And tagging is just magic strings that you apply logic to. In our case, we've decided to say, all right, we'll have 3 scopes. They're easy to understand. Scope client, that is, if this library is meant for client-side stuff. I should mention, it's not only client stuff we have in the repo, we also have a GraphQL written with TypeScript and Apollo and all that good stuff. So in that case, it would be scope server. And of course, something that is purely server does not talk to something purely client. We also have some tooling. That's also one of the benefits of NX. It's really easy to create scaffolding tools for generate a new library or generate a new React component or do whatever you want, and then have it mainstream for everything we do. And now that we're flipping it around and saying, hey, we want to build this for external developers as well, well, we want to make sure that they get the same benefits, right? So they get those benefits that we're building. So that's the scope. The next one is a little bit more tricky. It's visibility. It's talking about whether it is only visible for the host, that's the main application, or if it's inside the iframe. If it's inside the iframe, it is either a private application for Trackunit only, which we have a lot of right now, and then we have public. Visibility public means that this will have an NPM package that is deployed to an NPM registry. So anyone can download and install that. And of course, we don't want any public stuff to depend on private stuff. But how would you do that if we didn't put these rules in place? So private can depend on private stuff. Host can depend on host, and private and public. And that's the way it works. Public can depend on other public packages, but not private stuff. And then the last one here, you could live without it, but you will get into trouble sometimes because it's not always that you think about the layout nicely, which means you'll end up having a React component that depends on something in this library, and then this one over here will also depend on something over here. And the way you circumvent that is start adding some layers. In our case, we added an app. That's the Iris app. That's where the manifest is. That's where the marketplace details is. How do I sell this? Then we have extensions. That's what I talked about. You can have an extension being a fleet or an asset home or a report or something else. Again, it's a type extension. That's just a magic string, right? It cannot depend on other things of its own type, but it can depend on the React code. And vanilla is nice for us so that we can have components like I showed before that is purely CSS. It's not talking to React components. It's just plain vanilla JavaScript code or TypeScript code. Everything we have is TypeScript. Right? And again, same rules applies. Every vanilla can depend on other vanilla projects. It cannot depend on React, and React can depend on vanilla because that's fair. So we've set up these rules, and that means that we can have these 270 projects depend on each other and know that I cannot accidentally import something from a different library that's, oh, there was server-side code. Normally you wouldn't hit that right. But in the other case where it's only meant for the host, you might end up importing that in a public package. And then you just get a red line because of the ESLint rule. So it's really easy to manage. The way it looks is like this. So you have the manager up on top. It is of type app, it is scope client, and it's visibility host. That makes sense. Then we have this one. This one is of the type extension. It is scope client. And then this could be either visibility private or public. Public would be nice because then we knew that we could actually pull this out of the repo into its own repo, and then it would be able to depend on everything from NPM packages, and we could sell it off to a different company and say, hey, go maintain this part of the code base, right? So that's where we're trying to push everything. So we can use these tags to try to push our code in the right direction. Then we have the React components. They are public, they are a scope client, and they are type reacted. That means that no one or nothing in this code depends on private stuff. It can only depend on other public stuff, like the CSS components. So of course it depends on this one. That's of the type vanilla. It has the scope client. and it has the visibility public. So these two are available in NPM registry if you go look it up.